this computer. I think we're ready, Chrissy.
All right. So welcome to Chat with Green Aggies. Today is a group effort. We're going to talk about some fall favorites, and we kind of have, all over the board today. And so we'll learn about some of our fall favorites and maybe not so favorite near the end. We'll see. But okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started with introductions. Today we have Dr. Mung Mung Gu with us. Hello, Dr. Becky Bowling, Laura Miller, not very far away from Tarrant, and then we have Paul Winsky, way down in Harris County. All right, so without further ado, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. So the first topic we're going to be talking about today is something that has most of you have probably been hearing a lot about and thinking a lot about if you haven't already done so. Especially in our northern parts of the state, overseeding is a more common practice than down south, unless you, of course, have some certain site characteristics that you're looking to improve. So let's just think about why we would overseed anything, right? So home lawns aren't something that we regularly overseed unless we have a higher instance of traffic or, need some more some actively growing plants to actually, combat some of that traffic. Now, where we see overseeding regularly happening is sports fields, golf courses, and those types of things. So what we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to talk about the different choices that we have and the ones that are commonly used in our state. And so the first one we're going to talk about is perennial ryegrass. This is probably the most common one that we see used. It is a little bit higher seed cost just because of the improved characteristics that it has and just the overall hardiness that this plant can have. And the great thing about perennial ryegrass is it does establish relatively quickly. You usually see some seed up within 7 to 10 days. And so that's a relatively quick soil stabilizer and also just a green color that we can have out there. The great thing about perennial ryegrass is that it's pretty competitive with some of our winter annual weeds like annual bluegrass, which can be just an unsightly issue in some of our golf courses and some of our landscapes, of course. But in terms of ryegrass, perennial ryegrass is one of the main focuses of some of the seed companies. And so they're doing a great job with breeding efforts, building in things like not only wear tolerance, good heat tolerance, good drought tolerance, but also we're seeing an increase of disease tolerance when it comes to our ryegrasses. So things like gray leaf spot or some of our melting out diseases, we're seeing some improved characteristics. And so there are a lot of ryegrass cultivars. And so, you've heard us talk about the NTEP program before, the National Turf Grass Evaluation Program. You can visit that website. It is currently, it is still, like it was kind of tough to navigate and tough to look at the data, but they actually have a big grant right now through the USDA where they are looking at making it more user-friendly. So helpful for not only homeowners, but creating applications for, landscape managers, more professional type managers to really see the research that's going on and really find those good characteristics instead of having to kind of weed through all that data that's online. But again, perennial ryegrass is very hardy and it is one of the choices for overseeding that we typically have to use some type of transition aid to get rid of it in the spring, just because it's bred to be a little more hardy than some of our other ryegrasses are. Okay. Next is annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass is cheaper generally than perennial ryegrass is. And it's a quicker establishment. So 4 to 7 days. This might be something that, you might use in a less trafficked area, don't have a lot of heavy traffic, but you just need some quick green color, or maybe a soil stabilizer, erosion control over the winter that you didn't have a chance to establish warm season grass. So, hey, I just need something quick and cheap to put down to stop the erosion. This one is, it's used a lot in forages, but we also have more turf type, improved types that are coming out, just like ryegrass. Tons of different varieties that are out there, but I put some improved types down there, just some ones you can, look for and learn about the characteristics. But the great thing about annual ryegrass is it's an annual plant, right? And so it transitions a lot easier. Most of the time, you don't have to use any type of transition aid to actually get rid of that material, which is great. And Becky, if you want to circle the auricle, I love this plant because it's one of our only turf grasses that has a very noticeable clasping auricle. And so that's one of the key ID features of annual ryegrass, which I love. Okay.
So Chrissy, I have a quick question for you. And Becky did point out that in some municipalities, they don't allow overseeding of home lots.
True. Mm-hmm.
My pet peeve is overseeding of St. Augustine home lots.
Yes.
It drives me bonkers every time I see it because it just doesn't work very well.
Right.
So if you just say that, will you say that as a turf expert?
Yes, I will. And, I actually had a question and answer session with Travis County yesterday and talked a lot about why we don't really recommend overseeding for home lawns, just to do it. And especially not St. Augustine, just because it's already a kind of a finicky plant. It's a larger plant. And, ryegrass overseeding really has a tendency to weaken our warm season base. And so we generally don't recommend home lawn overseeding. And if we do, it might be only usually recommended for Bermuda grass or something like that, just because it's a more hardy plant, more aggressive plant that's able to overcome some of that weakening. And yes, there are a few locations around Dallas that overseed their St. Augustine every year. And then when it comes out in the spring, you can tell a noticeable difference of that. So.
Mung Mung has a question too there.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ballin. Let me
I thought she was just resting on her hand.
No, so the oracle that you insisted that Becky to point out, to circle around, can you tell us a little bit about the significance of the oracle of the grass?
Really is just an ID feature. That's what we typically use it
Nobody
for. It really
cares.
It really doesn't serve any main function, I would say, in the plant. Just a growth feature and a characteristic that can help us differentiate between certain grasses. So, if a homeowner or an agent or a turf professional sends us a photo of a grass, we always ask for a photo of that area if we can't tell initially what it is, just because it's got some key identification features there. So it's just
the vernation, oracle, ligule, and the blade tip. So those are the four.
Yeah, those are the four kind of main ones that we typically look at. And we typically look very closely at the ligule area, just because they, they're different sizes, they're different shapes, and they're different types. And so those are kind of the key ID features of grasses, I say.
And a seed head for sure. If
seed head for sure.
If you have a seed head, but
if there's no seed head, then that's when we ask.
Sometimes it's tough, and sometimes too, if it's in a mowed area, what we might recommend is that you actually dig out a sample, put it in a little pot, see if you can get a seed head off of it that way.
Yep, that's definitely a good suggestion for sure. Okay, then, the lesser known of the ryegrasses is called an intermediate ryegrass. It's really just a hybrid of perennial and annual. So you get a little bit of both worlds in this one. And so you get a little bit better traffic and better texture than just your typical annual ryegrass, but it's a little less than your perennial. So still a quick establishment, 4 to 10 days, depending on which variety you get. Pretty quick ground cover establishment. less heat tolerance, typically a lighter color green and a little bit more of a medium texture compared to something like perennial ryegrass. But the great thing about it is it transitions more quickly. You know, the majority of their varieties are called something like transition ryegrass or transition ryegrass or something like that. And so, you know, it's definitely an option where you want a little bit more hardy plant than annual, but you don't want as tough of a plant and a tough a transition aid as perennial ryegrass.
So Chrissy, when you
Yes.
say that transition aid, like what are you talking about? What does that really mean? And why do we need to be aware of that?
Sure. So, you know, when you overseed a warm season grass with a cool season grass, once the springtime rolls around, it's time for that warm season grass to wake back up and start growing again. So generally we want to get rid of that cool season grass. And so we don't have any competition. So it doesn't delay the green up. So it doesn't take away the nutrients and the water and things like that from the warm season grass greening up. So we might, need to, on especially perennial ryegrass, use something like a transition chemical that will spray out that cool season grass and not harm the warm season grass. But in the regarding like annual bluegrass or annual ryegrass, sorry, and intermediate ryegrass, we may not have to use that chemical. We might can just go out and mow it low, you know, and do things like cultural practices to get that grass out. So great question. And then one that more golf course superintendents like to use, especially on greens and maybe some tee boxes, is called rough bluegrass. This is Poa trivialis. Generally, it has a little bit more finer texture, light green color, but it's got great density. And so comparatively, though, to things like perennial ryegrass, it's going to be less wear tolerant, less competitive, which is why we typically use it for golf greens or tee boxes, somewhere that's going to not get a ton of traffic, but still, you know, a situation where we want it to look nice. This is a little more tolerant of shade than perennial ryegrass is, and also poorly drained areas where some of our ryegrasses might not be so keen on growing. But again, you know, multiple varieties of this, and you can check it out at ntep.org. I want to speed up because I know I'm taking a long time. So when to overseed, you know, we have, when we talk about seeding and planting, we have the ideal date, and then we have the general one that, you know, folks are really going to do. So ideally, it would be when the soil temperature is approximately 72 degrees at a 4-inch depth. So at least for 48 hours. And so in some parts of the state that has already passed, but in other southern parts of the state, you know, we are still above that soil temperature. And then we have the general planting date. Hey, I see that my Bermuda grass is slowing down, but I haven't, you know, got a frost yet. I'm going to go out and overseed. So that typically can be 4 to 6 weeks before that first average frost date. So we're still ahead of that in most locations. Although I did see that Dallas area is potentially touted for a light frost in about 2 weeks. That's of course, that's a long forecast, but it kind of gives you some ideas that, hey, we might get a frost in 2 weeks. If we need to do any last minute preventative applications, then this might be the time we need to do that. Okay. You can really skip this one.
Mhm.
Okay, so this is just a general guideline. Hey, I do want to overseed this year. Let me get an idea of kind of what are the seeding rates and where should I be in those seeding rates. So I also threw fine fescue in here just for fun. And so you can notice that, you know, perennial ryegrass, annual ryegrass have a relatively high seeding rate on like a green, 25 to 40 pounds per thousand. That's pretty high compared to something like Poa trivialis, which was the rough bluegrass, only 8 to 12. Anybody on the call want to guess why that's so different? What kind of things influence seeding rate?
Size of seeds?
Yeah, great. So seed size. thinking about the size of a perennial ryegrass or an annual ryegrass seed is going to be relatively large, right? And so the larger the seed, generally the more we're going to be able to recommend, because we want to get proper coverage. Now, rough bluegrass seed is relatively small, and so we can recommend a lower rate pretty much. Okay, one more. So this one's for golf courses, and this one is for general athletic field use, and then just basic general use, which might be something like your home lawn or just like a use site off site that's not getting a ton of traffic. So you kind of see, you know, the infield versus the outfield versus something like football. And of course you can change these rates depending on how much traffic you get. The great thing about ryegrass is that you can overseed throughout the year sometimes if you feel like you're having a wear spot on one side of your field and not the other side. You know, you can throw some more seed down during the year to get some more green cover. Okay, I think I've taken enough time, so moving on.
Okay, so I'm also going to talk about grass. No, I just think that right now in the fall, we really notice a lot of our large ornamental bunch grasses, especially like the pink muleys that you're probably, wherever you live right now, they look great. You're noticing them as you drive around town. I think these are all really beautiful plants for fall, and they're the plants that can take us into the winter and still provide some interest. And I think that this is a great time to talk about them. So here we go. All right, I found this quote from Hal Borland, who's an author. He wrote like a really famous young adult novel and was a journalist and everything, but I kind of like it. You know, trees are long-lived and you know, wonderful plants, and grass, on the other hand, just shows off all the time how hard it wants to stay alive and how it will continue to grow in so many places, especially Bermuda grass. But anyway, all of these grasses have something in common, and that's that they do form pretty impressive root systems. So that makes them pretty drought tolerant. It makes them pretty good for controlling erosion in certain sites. It makes them really valuable plants in the landscape. And that is a worthy thing. So I will commend them for that. Go ahead. This was a Chat with Green Aggie's Plant of the Week quite a while ago, and it's still my favorite muley grass, though I am going to talk about some others. I really love Landheimer muley grass because it can be used in so many different ways. It looks great, just one grass by itself. It looks as beautiful as like a Texas sage or, you know, anything you might want to use as a specimen shrub. It looks that great. Mung Mung, you have something to say?
This may be in most areas outside of East Texas, this may be the only muley that we can grow. I hate to say that I still like the pink golf muley
a lot.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, because this is from the Edwards Plateau. That's right. It's very drought tolerant. It's very tolerant of all kinds of high pH soils, and that makes it really, really useful all over the state. Now we'll go on to that next slide and talk a little bit about that Gulf muley. It is native to the eastern half of Texas, more or less. But this slide kind of shows you something, the one there where you can see my old truck and the old plantings of roses on Trail Drive when they first put them in, and they all got rose rosette, and all those roses are gone now. But I saw that muley grass this morning on my way to work. It's still there. It's looking great. Some people don't like grasses as a substitute for shrubs, and Neil Sperry is one of those people. But I think that in the right situation, they work pretty well as a shrub substitute. And they're also much less expensive in many cases than filling like a large bed with shrubs. Not that we don't love shrubs, because shrubs are great, but grasses really can get the job done. And that picture down below is from a nursery in Louisiana. Mung Mung might remember that from our IPPS, and I'm getting ready to go to IPPS on Saturday. But this was a couple of years ago in Louisiana, and nursery plants in their container pots are beautiful in my eyes, but not everyone finds them gorgeous. But everybody stopped and took a picture of this field of pink muley because it just looked so fabulous. Yeah, this was 2019 in South Louisiana. And then I did want to point out that we often call it pink muley. There is a white cultivar that's very attractive. It has really white seed heads. You can see that right there. It's called White Cloud. It's also a very striking plant. It looks that same, beautiful seed head impact that you get with the pink. All of these sort of fade as fall turns into winter. They kind of fade to a sandy light brown, but they're still attractive. Those seed heads still have a nice fluffy look, and they're still quite beautiful. So this is probably one of the most widely available ornamental grasses that's native to Texas that you can buy pretty much everywhere, anytime. Paul, you have anything to say about that?
Laura, I was going to ask you, do you think that the seed heads, could be used in bouquet?
Oh, absolutely. They sure can. Yeah, they're great. They're great in all kinds of fall floral arrangements. So Paul, did you have something to say about production?
It's one of my favorites. I guess it's probably one of the most popular ornamental grasses, at least down here. We see it a lot. And so it may start to get the moniker, the way people have complained about the roses, the knockouts being overplanted. They do use it a lot, but yeah. I still like it. I mean, at this time of year, when the sun catches it just right and the wind is blowing, the breeze is blowing, it adds a dynamic feature to the landscape.
Sure does. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's look at another species here. And this is actually the 2022 Perennial Plant Association Perennial Plant of the Year. Another Texas native. In fact, I took these pictures at the Fort Worth Nature Center. So these are actually native blue stems, not selected cultivars, though there are lots of great ones growing in the wild. This thing has an enormous root system. If you tried to dig up a clump of little blue stem, I can guarantee you that you would leave behind 90% of the root system. They're just really impressive. This is one of those native prairie grasses that used to populate the tall grass prairies of the Great Plains. A lot of our soils here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and really running down kind of the middle of the state are those blackland prairie soils, and this is a good plant for those soils. That little picture inside is actually split beard blue stem, which is related and also very pretty, but not as widely available, for landscape use. Though maybe that's next. I don't know. Somebody asked me how to say this. I say it's schizachyrum. Do y'all say it differently? I don't know. It is definitely used to be an andropogon, which is easier to say, but now it's a schizachyrum.
So Laura, KOLORS, colors?
Colors. Well, that was just, I just did that so that you would pay attention to it and remind me to talk about the colors of little blue stem. Thank you very much. It is called a blue stem because in the spring, this is a fall picture. In the spring, it has a nice green blue color. And then as you go into fall, you can see you get a lot of reddish purple colors. And some of these cultivars are really, really pretty. They have selected them to be more colorful. And then it fades into that kind of brown, but it's a nice brown. It's a nice brown. And once again, you get that movement. You get those seed heads that remain on the plant all the way through the winter if you don't cut them back too early. And I will talk about cutting back a little bit, though we're going to cover that when we talk about preparing for winter. Grasses protect themselves if you don't cut them back. They are still pretty through the winter, and that mass of plant material will protect the growing points of the grass. So they'll come through the winter better if you don't cut them back too early. I realize that for landscapers, sometimes you got to do what you got to do when you can do it. But if you do leave these through the winter, it improves their survival rates and it gives you a nice landscape element through the winter. And one of the saddest things that ever happened to me was I was driving in Florida. I used to work in 2 counties and I was driving over to the second county and I went once a week. And one day I went and the pink muley was gorgeous, and it was just down this median, and I thought, oh man, this is beautiful. And then the next week when I went, they had cut it back, and I was like, y'all, they didn't even wait for the flowers to fade a little bit. It was just so frustrating, but I guess that was when they had to do it on their schedule. So if y'all want to flip to the next one, I'll talk about one more grass. And this one I love so much, though not everyone agrees with me. This picture's in grapevine, and this is, in my opinion, the situation where this grass really shines. It will grow in shade. It will grow, and no other, not little blue stem, not Gulf muley, not, anything else will grow well in shade like that. It's just such a useful plant in so many situations for us. The movement on this one, Becky's pointing out, is really pretty. The seed heads are really pretty. It gets its, sea oats name because the seed heads look like oats. It's not an oat or anything, but it does get that name from that. And once again, you get a real pretty look. This is a fall picture. So when those seed heads come out, they're really bright, pretty green, and then they fade to kind of pink. They look kind of pink in this photo, and then they'll fade more into tan. So you get kind of a nice range of colors, a beautiful seed head. There is a cultivar that I've seen only a few times that's variegated foliage, river mist, but it's not widely available. I don't know. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is going to be the bomb. Everybody's going to want this. But I was wrong about that. I also thought the iPad was not a good idea. So what do I know?
So Laura, how does this one do in moisture situations?
It requires more moisture because it
Okay.
is like a riverine kind of species. It'll normally grow like along creeks and rivers.
Okay.
So it does require more moisture than the others. Becky pointed out it's salt tolerant. That's a really good feature of it. It can handle dry periods though, because if you think about it, it grows often near intermittent streams. So it has a good root system, can handle a dry period, but does like a little more moisture than
What
the
is
other.
the best time to plant that one? Because I'm thinking I have a shady, wet area in my backyard that I need a plant really bad.
And I want to put out from the chat, our friend Keith Henson said spreads with abandon. And Keith is
Good.
right.
I need some.
Keith is right about that. So you want to put it in an area where you want it to spread. So
Okay.
Chrissy, this is a fine time to plant that. This
Okay.
is a perfect time probably to plant it. If you have a friend or neighbor that has plants with seeds, you could wait until those seeds mature a little bit more, and then you could just gather seeds and spread them, sow them. But you can plant the container plants at any time, and this is a great time. I would be careful about where I put it because of what Keith said. You want it in an area where you want it to spread. I often use it with Turk's cap because that's kind of wild and crazy too. So in an area where you just want, plants and you got some shade, you don't want to mess with it a lot. This one, once a year, you can cut it back. Once again, if you'll wait until February or so, it'll do really well for you. And is a pretty darn low maintenance plant. If you think about it, all of these once a year to cut something back is not much. So, and if you don't cut it back, you know what, it'll be okay. It won't look quite as fresh, but it'll be all right. So these are great plants for so many landscape situations.
One thing I wanted to say, Laura, is that this one I find so versatile. And one of the ways that I try to convey that to people is that this has grown on every college campus I've ever been at, from Lubbock to Georgia to College Station. And it looked good every time. So.
Everywhere. That's a fabulous illustration. I'll steal that. I like it. And actually anything that grows in Lubbock, you have to give it a little bit of love. College Station too, actually, for that point. Georgia, though, they have some nice plants on campus, but
they do. And this was in a shadier area that was a tricky spot, and it had taken over and looked wonderful in Georgia. So we're by our pharmacy building. I remember it very,
very well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to make another little plug for ornamental grasses too. That we get a lot of questions sometimes around how to support wildlife in the landscape, and ornamental grasses can be really great for providing certain nesting materials and habitats for certain things that shrubs cannot. And so it does help to diversify that support as well, I think.
That's great. All right, Paul.
Okay. All
Let's
right.
have some flowers.
Sure thing. So let's go to the next slide, please. Or can I? There we go. So the first one, I'm going to look at just some annuals. I really like sweet alyssum for the fall. I like the growth habit on it. It's got that low growing ground cover, but the main thing I like about it is the fragrance. And so I'm always looking for ways to bring, that value added feature into the landscape, and alyssum does that. Purples, whites, pinks, lavenders, things like that. Does well in the full sun, and it's great for bringing in beneficial insects. We had this. We put out some sticky cards with it a couple of years back just to capture see what beneficials were coming in, and long-legged flies. You name it, we were catching it. So it's a good pollen source for the beneficials if there's not a lot of prey there for them. Next slide. Of course, the next two slides are going to be pansies and violas. And so the pansies are the larger flowered ones. The thing that's really the breeders have done is and the seed companies have done is just really expanded the color palette on these, from the clears to the cat whiskers to the dark blotched ones. And the other thing they do is they do a really good job of mixing the colors that they have into, specific, like, the seaside blues or something like that, or the beacons fields and things like that. So, it's the larger bloom. And the other thing the breeders have done is they've done a really good job with regard to, I guess, being able to get them into the ground earlier down here, because they've bred some heat tolerance into them. The Colossus, the Matrix series, they both do very well down here early on, and will carry through to the cooler part of the year. Next slide is our violas. And so, do you want fewer large flowers with the pansies, or do you want a lot of smaller flowers? And the flower power on the violas is really pretty impressive. And so if you've got these in a bed, as they fill in, you're going to see color throughout the entire season. You can see they've got the clears in here, and we've also got what we call the cat whiskers on them. They've got some blotched ones, but they just really, the proliferation of flowers is really strong. So in certain cases, I think the flower power on these are much better than what we see with the pansies. And then the next slide, the next one that I want to talk about is stock. And I know we're starting to see more and more of this. The thing I like about it, again, this is another one with fragrance. And so bringing that fragrance in is great. You can use it as a cut flower, so you can bring it into the house and enjoy it that way. You'll see in here, gosh, I remember early on, 20 years ago, early on, that's a while ago. I guess I'm dating myself, but early on, you didn't see the consistency in the double blooms like you're seeing in the flower heads here in this image. You would get some singles and things like that. And so, again, the breeding companies have done an excellent job in being able to do, find those parents, develop those F1s so that they are seeing that consistent, flowering up the entire stem, but we're also seeing those double flowers. And you can see this is pretty much typical for the color range that you will see: the lavenders, the pinks, some maroons, the reds. Most of these are going to be in that. Probably the landscape side is going to be about 12, 15 inches, maybe up to 20. And then there are cut flower varieties that if you went online, you could find some of those taller ones. So if you really wanted to have a dramatic effect in the landscape, in your border for the cool season, you could also look at a couple of those varieties. So, and I think that covers it for the annuals.
Hey, thank you, Paul, for talking about the annuals. I last winter I planted some dianthus in my garden, and this year being a very unusual year, the winter storm Uri did not kill them, and then the moisture we've been having through the spring and early summer, and the summer not being super hot this year, so they have survived. They just have been flowering. So it saved me a lot of money to buy.
Do you know what series you planted?
I don't remember. I need to go
Okay.
back and look at the labels.
Yeah, because they've got some hybrids out now that are crossed with the Barbados and things like that. And they're not just cool season anymore. We've seen the neons and the jolts and things like that are just blooming in the fall, in the winter, through the spring and the summer. So it's really pretty impressive. The colors, the stiffness of the stems, so they hold up in the rain and things like that. So they've done a really nice job with a lot of the dianthus.
Yeah, I'm going to testify. I planted Jolt the last fall, and they are still, I mean, they slowed down blooming in the summer, don't get me wrong, but they're still alive and looking okay. So that's not bad. Yeah. Okay, Mong Mong, let's talk about crepe myrtle bark scale.
Yes, let's move on to crepe myrtle bark scale. So Becky, if you could go back to that slide, I just I'm not going to talk about all about crepe myrtle bark scale. That requires half day to a full day, but almost everything we have is available at stopcmbs.com, and lots of slides, publications available there for you to view at your leisure. So now let's next slide. Just look at some pictures of what crepe myrtle, what kind of damage that crepe myrtle bark scale they can do. What they may look like. So on this one, let's see whether I could do this annotation. Okay. Can you all see my mouse pointing to this big fat one? Okay. So this is likely a female cocoon, and this is a male cocoon. So the way to tell the female from the male is really the size, because there is a pregnant female inside, and gradually laying eggs, and as those eggs hatch, the little crawlers move out. The size of the female gradually decrease, it shrinks, and at the end it just dies. These little ones start to crawl out and find a place to what is that word I'm looking for? Start to feed on these on the crepe myrtle branches, stems, and if it's a male, it will naturally grow hair and protect itself, become a cocoon. If it's a female, it has to become pregnant to be able to develop this white hair and become a cocoon. Next.
That doesn't seem very fair.
Then I have to say, well, I'll show you in the next one that things are fair. I'll tell you why. So this is just some more pictures. If you see these like really nasty black sooty mold on the right, or you see the sooty mold, and then you some kind of like, if you look at we know that crepe myrtles do have the peeling bark, but if you look at this just look like, like you have a scar on your on your arm, on your leg, and then you kind of prematurely, instead of letting the scar fall off itself, you peel it, and this often makes me think that they look like that peeled scar, not the natural scar falling off. And I think that they may have a lot to do with crepe myrtle bark scale feed in. And just common theme here, common thing that you will see is this sooty mold on stems, sooty mold on trunks. And because these are bark scales, so they feed on the bark, and the honeydew secreted from the bark, they drop down, they tend to drop down. So that's where the sooty mold develops. Slightly different from the sooty mold caused by crepe myrtle aphids is that aphids feed on leaves, and especially tend to feed on younger, tender leaves, and that's on their outer canopy. So you will get a lot of sooty mold on the leaves. I'm not saying, depending on the structure of how you prune your crepe myrtle, you may have a lot of sooty mold on the leaves due to crepe myrtle bark scale, in addition to aphids. Next, please. Laura, feel free to chime in anytime you want. If look closer, you may see these like a wide sesame, half size of the sesame seeds. I just realized that probably not everyone knows what the size of the sesame. Laura, I need your help here. What's roughly, what would you say is the size of scales of these mature cocoons?
Instead of a sesame seed, like
Yeah, it's a,
I have Googled it,
you have Googled it.
and the size of scale insects can be from 1/8 to 1/2 of an inch.
That's common scale. That does not apply.
yeah, so Google what's the size of a sesame seed.
that doesn't
Sesame
apply
seed
to.
is-
So
3 to 4 millimeters long.
millimeters. So we're just confusing our audience.
Confusing our
confused.
people even more.
I'm confused too.
Let's move on. So this is a plant on the left with heavy infestation. I'm not sure whether the size difference, this one compared to these two not or less infected, was completely due to crepe myrtle bark scale, but I think the scale definitely contributed to the smaller size, as it just affect the overall health of plants. Next, please. This is how you tell whether these scales, whether this is a scale or like other similar bugs, mealybugs, because mealybugs bleed brown and a crepe myrtle bark scale bleed pink. Next, please. By the way, that's my hand. Can we go back? I just want to show I just want to show you all, that's my hand. If you look at this tattoo, this point, blue dot tattoo, see that it's right here. You may not be able to see it. All right, next, please. So this, just look closer and closer, and also, under microscope, what they look like. Next, please. This is a poke open one of the egg sacs, shows the eggs, the little eggs, and they're, the female is somewhere right here. Shrivel away its life to the babies. Next, please.
Mung, you're kind of like a terrifying entity to these crepe myrtle bark scales. You're making them bleed. You're poking open their egg sacs.
We definitely torture them. So this is even under more greater magnification. See the little scales, and this is the size of, this is just the tip of I think scissors, the tweezers. Next, please. This is what they look like, the size, and we have the millimeter the rough size of different stages of these scales. And as you can see, these 2 eggs, like this is the one probably just started to lay eggs, so that you could see that it's still pretty big and shiny, versus this female is at the end of its egg laying period. It's shriveled up, it's not as shiny as this one. The size is comparatively smaller because it gives her life all to the little baby eggs. Next, please. Okay, so here's the thing. Becky, you said whether it's fair or not fair. At their baby stage, at the instar stage, that they have this long stylid penetrate through the xylem into phloem to suck nutrient solution from phloem, and also drink water from xylem. As it progresses into whether it's a male or a female, so the female would develop this white hair as after mating. So if it doesn't if it doesn't get fertilized, it would just still just feeding on the tree. Versus the male does not have mouthpiece, so it does not feed. And generally they only live like 3 to 5 days. So Becky, this is the fair part. If she doesn't get fertilized, and we have seen that just live like almost forever, 5-6 months. And so one of the work that we're under progress is that we try to disrupt this mating process. If we could just get rid of all the males and stop them from mating, then this will not get fertilized. If it doesn't get fertilized, she's not going to lay eggs. This is what the female look like. And so my student is picking up these newly laid eggs onto crepe myrtle stems to study their life cycle. Next, please. So there are natural enemies. And if you look at these scary things, these are lady beetle exuvias. At this time of the year, probably a month ago, you will see your tree may be covered in scale. And if you have a huge scale population, and then a month later, like right now, if you look at all those scales, may be cleared up by these lady beetles. Next, please. Yeah, they look really, really scary. And, if you don't like, this kind of giving you the slightly disgusting look, but hey, hatched from those cases, exuvias are these super nice looking lady beetles. Becky, you want to say something? Okay, so there are more species than I can identify. These are the work from our team members, like Dr. Mike Merchant, retired, and Dr. Erfan Wafai, who went for a greener pasture. When I say greener pasture, I mean more money. So yeah, so these are some of the beneficials that could be working on the tree. So, take a close look at these beneficials. Don't mistaken them as bad guys. They're very good. We don't know the function of the ants at this point. We think it's probably more likely bad than good when it comes to crepe myrtle bark scale control. Next, please. Then it's on you, Becky.
Yay. Okay, so that was awesome. I don't think I'd seen some of those pictures before. It's pretty cool. I'm going to wrap it up by talking about some of my favorite fall weeds. some of these I genuinely do like. So there's a little bit of sarcasm there, but not total sarcasm. So we'll start with the ones that are not that bad. So this is the time of year that we start to see, as we get into late summer, early fall, and then through the winter, we'll see a lot of our legume weeds being more active. I'm a big fan of legumes. I've talked about them here on Chat with Green Aggies before. We do see a lot of benefits of allowing them to just do their thing in the landscape and in our lawn areas. Because they're legumes, they have that ability to form symbiotic relationships with bacteria in the soil and fix nitrogen. So I'll share some of those benefits here in a minute, but I wanted to start by just showing some of the ones that I tend to see more of. One of these, maybe I don't like as much as the other three. You guys can guess which one that is. The top two look very similar to one another, and a lot of times they're mistaken for one another. We have both of them throughout Texas. White clover there in the upper left-hand corner is actually going to be a true perennial. And it is a very, it can be, once it's well established, can really take over an area and do very well. There next to it is ball clover, which is an annual that looks very similar to white clover, but the flowers are going to be just a little smaller. They're actually typically going to be a little rounder. So that plant's going to look just a little different, a little bit more petite almost than the white clover. Then we have several different types of vetch that we may see in turf grass systems and in other parts of the landscape. These are also going to be legumes. They have a pretty attractive little purple flower that I really like. And then of course we have Burr Clover, which is not a true clover. It's a medic. It's in the Medicago genus. And so it's also related to things like black medic. And it does produce little sticker burrs. I don't find them quite as irritating as sand burr, but still pretty irritating. They're the kind of burrs that just love to get stuck in your dog's paw hair. And they're just really hard to untangle and get out. So that one you may want to make more of an effort to control if you've got it. I did want to hit some benefits of these real quick. So the first is that we do see pollinators love a lot of these plants. And so, if we've got a lot of them in our lawn and landscape areas, especially as we're starting to see our turf grass go dormant and it's not really active anyways, you may just say, hey, I'm just going to leave this here, allow it to be forage material for some of our bees before we get into that much colder part of the year. And the other thing that I'll say too is, because these are nitrogen fixing, we often see them kind of proliferate in lawns where we've got a nitrogen deficiency. So a lot of times we refer to these as indicator weeds. They may indicate that there's some nutrient imbalances in our soil, particularly when they're out competing our turf grass for space. And along these lines, we will see some potential soil benefits associated with these. Now, a lot of times with these plants, we don't necessarily see a net increase in nitrogen. They're not necessarily contributing nitrogen to the soil, but they're also not consuming nitrogen. And we also see an impact of these in terms of changing the microbial ecology of the soil, having an impact on soil health. And then we also have some good data to show that many of these plants and other dicots similar to this are very effective rooters in our very heavy, fine textured soils. And so what this means is they can significantly help to improve infiltration and water capture. And again, if we're talking about a lawn scenario in winter where our turf grass is not particularly active, and we're talking about a time of year that for many parts of Texas is very wet, we may want as much infiltration and water capture as we can get to reduce runoff from our landscape areas. I also find generally these legume weeds are pretty attractive. Aside from the Burr Clover, even the Burr Clover looks good for a while until it starts to produce the burrs. But I find them relatively attractive, relatively low growing. They don't really bother me so much. If you do have clients that are just like, absolutely not, I do not want these in my lawn and landscape, you can certainly use a number of our broadleaf herbicides to help control these if you get them out there earlier in the season. But you also may just have a conversation with that client about also changing their nutrient management program and explaining some of these benefits that we just talked about as well. Here are some other familiar faces that we start to see show up this time of year. So many of us certainly are familiar with henbit. It's in the Lamiaceae family, so it's in the
Becky,
She's
frozen up?
right?
Yeah, Becky's frozen, I think.
I can't believe that Becky is killed by the weeds.
Oh no.
Can
She's
you guys
probably
hear
gonna,
me? Can you hear me?
probably gonna try to get back on, but
Yeah, we can hear you.
there.
Better?
Yes.
Yes,
Kind of for now? Okay.
very good.
As soon as that happened, I got like the warning of like your internet connection is unstable. So, so where did I drop? I don't know where I dropped.
On this page, let's just start over.
Yeah, you stopped at the henbit genus,
Okay.
I think, or family.
Yeah, so this is another one that I don't really mind sometimes if we're talking about a low input. Laura's face, I see Laura's face. Am I still frozen?
No, you're
Okay.
okay.
If we're talking about a low input system, and this is at least providing us some kind of vegetative cover in those winter months, but it can be very invasive, very aggressive. It can create some issues for our turfgrass systems. Many of the weeds that you see here are winter annual broadleaf weeds. So if we're having a lot of issues with these weeds, and we'll talk about this more here in a minute, but it can be important to rethink what are the pre-emergence herbicides that I'm using, and are they going to be effective on broadleaf weeds? Because many of the products that we may be using in our program may have limited efficacy with broadleaf weeds. And so we see that be an issue, particularly, I would say, in the wintertime, where we just get a lot of annual broadleaf plants that move into these systems. You know, we're not necessarily mowing these systems as often, and the turf grass is not as active or as competitive. And so it's really easy environment for these weeds to proliferate. There next to it is going to be common chickweed. This is one that I see a lot in shadier areas in the landscape. We have one that's related to it that's mouse ear chickweed as well. It's also one that we'll see sometimes do fairly well in compacted soils. So it can be a sign that there's some environmental conditions there that are not favoring our turf grass, and that allow this weed to take hold at the beginning of that cooler season. And then it just continues to grow and stay active as our turf grass goes dormant. This one down here, bottom left, I see everywhere. It's all over Texas in many different places. Bitterweed, little tiny bunch type grass that produces little yellow rain disc flowers. It's in that Asteraceae family. And so that's another one that we'll start to see be pretty active this time of year, and we'll see it continue to stay active into the spring a lot of times. And then finally, another one that I see a lot is one that a lot of folks mistake for dandelion, but it is a different plant. This is common groundsel. So we're going to see a lot, much greater floral density on this plant. The lobes of the leaves are going to be a lot more defined than what we will see on a dandelion, but it is still going to have that really pronounced taproot. We'll see it start as a little rosette, and that's a good time to target it for post-emergence herbicide application. Once it starts to produce those flowers, it's going to be more challenging to control. This is one I get a lot of questions about this time of year, and I know agents can probably relate to this. This is a weed that is not truly, it's not a winter weed. It's one that we see typically germinate mid to late summer, but this is the time of year that people really notice it. This is when it really starts to flower. It's really taken over an area. It can be sometimes a little harder to distinguish from grass initially until it's flowering. It's got some slender leaves, and its growth habit is such that sometimes it's really hard if you're not paying really close attention to see that it's growing. And by the time we notice it and it gets to this stage in this top photo, what we see on this plant is a really, really deep taproot, and the plant is pretty woody. And so herbicide programs are not going to be particularly effective at that stage. A lot of times this weed has a reputation for being, quote, difficult to control, but the issue is really more one of timing. A lot of times we're using post-emergence herbicides on on this weed way too late in the season. And if we really want to have an effective program, we know we have a history of this weed. We want to try to target a more of an early post-emergence program. That means doing some judicious scouting, looking for kind of what you see in this bottom left-hand photo, and going out there with that post-emergence herbicide in those summer months where we can try to control this before it starts to get that deeper taproot and really start to flower. I will say that this one, once it is flowering, is another one that's very popular with bees. Something to kind of be mindful of is when you have a lot of weeds like this in the landscape, and in particular in your turf grass areas, that bees and other pollinators are going to favor, we want to be really, really conscientious about the pesticides that we use, and recognize that things that we may choose to put out on our turf grass lawns that we don't really think about can be really harmful to pollinators when we've got a lot of these plants present that they're drawn to. So you really want to try to avoid using pesticides during periods where weeds like this are flowering actively. That goes, we have a lot of laws and regulations around this for insecticides in particular, but I even really try to emphasize this for any pesticide product you may be using, herbicides as well. Just sort of being mindful of this. One thing that we can do is, prior to using any pesticide, we can go through and try to mow off any of the flowers that are there. But again, all the more reason to really focus on early season control before we get to this reproductive stage where these plants are producing blooms. And then, of course, we could not wrap up today without talking about our two favorite winter annual grassy weeds. Chrissy already alluded to one of them earlier, annual bluegrass, Poa annua. This one, of course, as we've talked about on here before, we actually have a huge multi-million-dollar grant to look at the proliferation of this particular weed. We also know that we have some growing herbicide resistance issues when it comes to this weed. And so that's especially important for our professionals watching, to be mindful of the fact that even in lawn care systems, in screenings that we've done across multiple states, we've seen evidence of herbicide resistance showing up in populations coming out of residential and commercial lawns. And so a lot of times with professional landscape management, we tend to underemphasize the importance of rotating our modes of action, our sites of action for our pesticide products. But in any system that we are applying pesticides, we really want to make that a priority to prevent resistance. And just to remind you, resistance essentially means that we have an evolution, certain biotypes in these populations that are no longer responsive to pesticides. And this is something that can extend to any type of pest. In this case, we're talking about weeds, but we also see pesticide resistance in insects and disease as well. And so if you are a professional landscaper, golf course superintendent, sports turf manager, and you're managing these annual grassy weeds, have any kind of intensive weed control program, really want to try to get on a program where you're rotating the site of action for your pre-emergence herbicide and the sites of action for your post-emergence herbicides. And if you're ever confused or not sure how to do that, please contact one of us, myself or Chrissy in particular, and can really help you to kind of think through that. One easy way to do it is if you look at herbicide labels, you will typically find on that label a WSSA group number. That is a group number assigned to that product by the Weed Science Society of America that reflects the site of action for that product. So I can get into a habit of making sure that the different products I use are in different groups. We do see a lot of confusion when we say rotate products. We see people that just change different brand names or change active ingredients, and that's not enough to solve the problem. We have to actually change the chemical family, change the site of action. I'll give a great example that professional turf grass managers will be able to relate to, which is, a lot of times we see folks utilizing a product like Forum Sulfuron or Revolver. And if they see that that product doesn't seem to be working, one of the first things that they'll try to switch to is trifloxysulfuron or Monument. Those products have the same site of action. If I'm seeing potential resistance to one, switching to the other is only going to make that problem worse. So again, if you ever have questions, confusion about this, please, please, please do not hesitate to contact us. This is becoming a greater and greater problem in turf and ornamental systems. We're a little bit behind big agricultural systems in terms of dealing with this issue, but it's catching up to us now. We really need to start being very diligent about this. Next to our Poa annua is another one that we have in just ridiculous amounts here in North Texas. Laura and I have talked about this before. Rescue grass. My backyard here in Plano is a rescue grass backyard about 5 months of the year. And so I'm not sure why it's especially problematic here, but it is. It does produce, you can kind of see what the seed head looks there at the bottom. A lot of times we won't see that seed head until pretty late in the season, but it also does have a lighter lime green color. And it's definitely going to have a thicker leaf blade than what we're going to see on Bermuda grass, at least, and a little bit thinner than what we would see in St. Augustine. So just a reminder, we're kind of, Christy already mentioned, we're a little bit past the ideal window for overseeding. Same is true for many parts of the state with pre-emergence herbicides. Now, one thing I will say is that, for professionals, not for homeowners and for hobbyists, but for professionals that are managing high input systems like sports field, golf courses, big parks, we are starting to recommend looking at a split or sequential application program for fall and winter months, particularly for certain parts of Texas as we go central, south Texas. We do see with some of these weeds, and Poa annua, annual bluegrass as an example, a couple years ago in 2019, we were doing some research looking at emergence of that weed. We saw the typical big flush we expected in the fall, right around early November that year. We had a kind of a late fall that year. And then we saw a second flush just as big in January. So depending on the pre-emergence herbicide that I used, depending on the residual activity of that product, I may have had no protection against that second flush. And so that's something we want to be mindful of. And also, we hear a lot of things like, oh, it's too late for pre-emergent. I have mixed feelings about some of that. I think it depends a lot on the weed. It depends a lot on the year. We've talked about before, weeds don't sit in the ground and wait for the calendar to flip to a certain date. And sometimes what we might see is, maybe you missed the window for some of it, but if you still put that product out now, you may still at least get some benefit for certain species or benefit for a certain percentage of that population that has not emerged yet. So again, if you're ever confused about that, contact one of us so we can help. Laura, were you going to say something?
I was going to say too, one of the problems that people have growing those large ornamental bunch grasses in landscapes is weed management. And when you look at post-emergent products, there's not a lot of good options, but pre-emergence work well in those systems. So it's worth doing. And you don't want to have to deal with a bunch of rescue grass in your muley, or, you just don't want to. So.
Yeah, and that's so true for our turf grass systems as well, that, turf grass is so closely related to most of these grassy weeds that the number of products we have that are going to be able to control those weeds and not harm our turf or our ornamental grasses, very limited number of products. And so pre-emergence herbicides and a good integrated weed management program, mulch in your beds, doing what you can to reduce introducing pests accidentally, all of those good things we're supposed to do, really, really important, especially with some of these annual grassy weeds, for sure. Okay. Oh, and I was just gonna do a little quick plug to, or a little mention, because I talked about pre-emergence for broadleaf weed control. Christy and I have talked about this some before. We do certainly have some products like Spectacle and Dazaflam that professionals can use that can control a very broad spectrum of weeds. If we're using something like Dimension, which is dithiopyr, or pendimethalin, or prodiamine, which is Barricade, we may get some broadleaf weed control with those products, but maybe not as much as we might with Indazaflam. And that's where we're starting to see more folks combine, and some of these companies combine those active ingredients with isoxaben, which is the active ingredient in Gallery. So we will see products like Crew for example, which will combine basically Dimension and Gallery into one product. So we still get that good grassy weed control, but we're also adding a little extra broadleaf weed control. And I'm not going to remember the names off the top of my head right now. There's one that does, Chrissy, you might, with prodiamine and isoxaben. I can't remember the name of that one.
Yeah, I think it might be
It's like Mirage or something like that. I shouldn't say, I don't know. I'm not sure what it is, but we can look it up.
I can't remember.
And share it. But there's several options like that now, more than there used to be.
There definitely is one with prodiamine and sulfentrazone too that you could use as like a pre-post, but I can't think of the other one either.
Yeah, and using those pre-mixed products can also be helpful with that resistance prevention as well. Okay, you can catch today's Chat with Green Aggies and others past in our archives. They're on the Texas Plant Clinic YouTube page, so you can go on and check that out. We've got a little QR code there to connect you. We also do want your feedback. Please get on, give us some feedback via surveys. You know, we're getting close to the end of this year, which I just can't believe. And we're going to continue to have some discussions amongst our group about how we can continue to get better and make sure that we're servicing our industry to the best of our ability. So please get on and check that out and give us your feedback. In terms of what's coming up for the rest of the year, we really only have 3 more programs. So we are going to do disease prevention in fall and greenhouse sanitation on November 4th. November 18th, we'll do kind of a follow-up to what happened after the winter storm last year. We had a lot of requests to talk about how to protect plants and prevent excessive damage in the future. And so we're going to talk about that on here as a group. Some things that you can do as we go into winter. I'm already hearing buzz that we're probably going to have a storm similar to that again this year. I don't know what you guys have heard, but I guess based on the almanac says that we may have a similar winter storm this year. So it'll be good to prepare. You know, we'll say that and we'll do all the preparation and then it'll be 60 degrees all winter, right? So who knows? And then on December 2nd, we're going to do a special, it's a year-end review. I think Dr. Ong's going to lead this a little bit, but maybe the rest of us will contribute as well, really looking at what are some of the trends that we saw this past year, what are some of the things that we're seeing in Texas, and what might it mean for us moving forward.
Sounds good, Dr. Bolin.
Great job.